Late one evening, a woman named Emily returned to her childhood home. It had been years since she last visited, and she had come to clear out some of her old things. The house was old, situated at the edge of a quiet, wooded area far away from the nearest neighbour. Emily remembered it being full of warmth and love as a child, but now it felt colder, quieter. The first thing she noticed when she stepped through the front door was the heavy silence that seemed to settle over everything. The air smelled faintly of dust, but there was something else, something unfamiliar. She couldn't quite place it, but it made her uneasy. As she wandered through the house, the floors creaked beneath her feet, and the walls seemed to whisper. It wasn't long before she heard the first sound, soft footsteps echoing from the upstairs. "Emily! Hello!" Emily called out, her voice trembling slightly. No answer. She chalked it up to the old house settling, a trick of the mind in the quiet darkness. But as she continued to unpack boxes in her old bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The house had always felt comforting when her family lived there, but now it felt strange, alien. The noise came again, a soft shuffle of footsteps, slow and deliberate. Emily's heart began to race. Her thoughts went to her childhood dog Charlie, who had passed away several years ago. Could it be him? Her mind was grasping at straws, trying to find a rational explanation. But Charlie had always slept downstairs, and the footsteps were coming from above. She tried to focus on the task at hand, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. The house felt alive in a way that was unsettling. The temperature dropped in certain rooms, and the air felt thick, like she was breathing in something stale. Suddenly she heard a faint whisper. It came from the top of the stairs, just out of view. Mother's voice! Emily! Her blood ran cold. That voice, it was unmistakable. It was her mother's voice, but her mother had passed away years ago. Frozen in place, Emily couldn't move, couldn't speak. She just stood there, staring at the staircase, waiting for something to happen. And then, as if on cue, the footsteps began again, closer this time, each one slower than the last, until they stopped at the top of the stairs. Mother's voice. Emily. The voice echoed again, but this time it sounded different. The tone was lower, distorted, as if something unnatural was speaking through it. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she mustered the courage to step toward the stairs. She called out, "Emily, Mum!" But there was no reply. She felt the weight of the silence press in on her as she slowly climbed the stairs, each step creaking loudly in the otherwise still house. When she reached the top, she stopped, her breath caught in her throat. The hallway stretched out before her, the door to her old room just a few feet away. The house was dark, save for the dim light from the hallway lamp that flickered erratically. Suddenly the door to her old room creaked open on its own. Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. She stepped forward, her footsteps hesitant and slow. As she entered the room, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and the air thickened. The room was just as she remembered it, except for one thing. On her bed lay a small, old-fashioned doll, one she hadn't seen in years. She couldn't recall ever leaving it there, and it was positioned upright, staring straight ahead. A chill ran down her spine. She walked toward the bed, her legs heavy, as though the room itself was holding her back. The doll's empty eyes followed her every movement, its cracked porcelain face frozen in a permanent, unsettling smile. Suddenly she heard the unmistakable sound of a door slamming downstairs. Her heart leapt in her chest as she turned and ran down the hallway. The house seemed to stretch out, the walls closing in around her as she rushed back to the staircase. She descended the stairs in a panic, barely noticing the dark shadow that seemed to move just out of the corner of her eye. As Emily reached the bottom of the stairs, she froze. At the far end of the hallway stood a figure, tall and indistinct, barely a shadow in the dim light. Her heart skipped a beat as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure was completely still, but it exuded an overwhelming sense of dread. She opened her mouth to call out, but no words came. The figure began to move slowly toward her, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was stumbling through a dream. As it drew closer, Emily felt a coldness seep into her very bones, the chill so deep that it felt as though it was coming from within her. Her legs buckled beneath her and she collapsed to the floor, her mind racing with confusion and fear. The shadow reached out toward her, its long, skeletal fingers inching closer, but before it could touch her, a loud crash came from the kitchen. Emily jumped, her attention snapped away from the figure. She looked toward the source of the sound, heart pounding, but the figure was gone, vanished into thin air. She scrambled to her feet, desperate to escape the suffocating presence that had overtaken the house. She ran toward the kitchen, her breath ragged. The door was wide open and the room was a mess. Drawers pulled out, cupboards swinging open and dishes scattered across the floor. The air was thick with the smell of decay. In the center of the room she spotted something odd, a large dark stain on the floor as though something had been spilled there. She knelt down to examine it, her fingers trembling as she reached out. As soon as her fingers brushed the stain, she recoiled in horror. It was sticky, cold and thick. It didn't feel like anything she had ever touched before. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. A voice whispered in her ear, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakable in its malicious tone. Suddenly the kitchen light flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The sounds around her intensified, the soft whispers growing louder, the creaking of the house becoming more pronounced. Then she heard the sound that would haunt her forever, the unmistakable sound of a child's laughter, high-pitched and gleeful, coming from just behind her. She spun around, but no one was there. The last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her was the laughter again, this time closer, much closer, and the cold, familiar whisper. And then silence.